There are many other selection methods than what we can cover here, but I'd like to mention a couple more, albeit a little bit briefly. A work sample is when you have an applicant actually do the task that they would do. For example, for the job of a manuscript editor, you could give them a sample document and ask them to identify and fix errors. Work samples sometimes take the form of simulations which attempt to recreate a work environment. Probably the most famous is a flight simulator, which is designed to look and feel just like a real cockpit. An assessment center is not a location. It's basically a collection of exercises for selecting managers and administrators. You can think of it as a white-collar work sample. Usually there are multiple exercises and multiple people evaluating the applicants. They will evaluate them on a variety of dimensions such as leadership, decision-making, interpersonal effectiveness, and judgment. These make sense since it's geared towards managers. Two examples of assessment exercises that are usually found in an assessment center are the in-basket technique and the leaderless group discussion. In the in-basket technique, an applicant has to read a series of memos, notes, and other paperwork that inform him or her about tasks that need to be done. The applicant then has to decide which tasks to handle in which order, which gets at prioritization, and how they will handle each one, which gets at problem solving. So this is an example back in my days in graduate school where we did an assessment center for undergraduate students, and this was me testing it out. So this is a memo from the Office of the Bursar saying that I have an outstanding bill and I have to decide how am I going to deal with this. And this is my response. Pretty messy because it's a fast-paced task. In a leaderless group discussion, applicants form small groups and are given a task to solve or an issue to discuss. So this is a schematic from above of how we did a leaderless group discussion. There's a group of 6 people, represented by the little circles there, sitting around a round table, which is the big circle in the middle. And then we videotaped each of the people in the group discussion. So you can see the boxes represent video cameras that are pointed towards people across the table. So the light blue one is pointed at the blue circle and the yellow one is pointed at the yellowy-orange circle there. Applicants are rated on such dimensions as analytical skill, leadership, and interpersonal skill. Now, assessment centers do seem to work. They're valid in predicting overall performance, but they're quite time-consuming and expensive to run. As a result, they're often used in training and development as much or more than in actual hiring. We're going to finish our discussion of predictors by talking about a few tools that are used for hiring purposes which have significant problems. First, graphology is the analysis of handwriting of an individual in order to infer personality traits and behavioral tendencies. Graphologists look at the size, slant, width, regularity, and pressure of a writing sample. Although it's not particularly popular in the United States, it's relatively common in Western Europe, in countries such as France, where it's used by as many as 85% of companies. It also gets used quite a bit in Israel as well. Research suggests that graphology has quite low reliability. Remember, we're shooting for 0.8 at least. What we've seen is 0.3 to 0.6. And in terms of validity, it has none. Shouldn't be used. More common, for the United States at least, are references and letters of recommendation. They're used a lot for graduate school admission as well as employment, but there's a serious problem with leniency, because past employers are uncomfortable with giving negative recommendations. Applicants also get to hand-pick their recommenders. It seems they might be useful for separating the very unqualified from the rest of the applicants, but they're not valid beyond that. Finally, the polygraph or lie detector test was used widely to screen applicants a few decades ago. In the polygraph, 3 types of physiological data are taken: GSR, or galvanic skin response, heart rate, and breathing rate. Questions are asked that are either baseline, such as irrelevant and non-emotional questions, like what's your name, what's your address, or true questions, such as have you ever stolen from a past employer. Examiners look for a heightened physiological response to the true questions relative to the baseline questions. If your heart rate and breathing rate increase after being asked a particular true question, that's seen as evidence that you might not be answering truthfully. Here's an interesting side fact. The psychologist William Moulton Marston was one of the developers of what became the polygraph. He was also a feminist theorist, and with the help of his wife created a comic book hero, Wonder Woman. It's no accident that Wonder Woman could force somebody to tell the truth by tying them up with her golden lasso. Research suggests that the polygraph is highly inaccurate and also quite offensive to most applicants. Two problems are that, one, people can elevate their physiological response to baseline questions by doing something like biting their tongue or stepping on a tack that they've placed in their shoe. I'm not suggesting you take this approach, but the second problem is that those who are nervous about being tested are more likely to have elevated responses regardless. Also, the polygraph has consistently been found to have a high false positive rate. In other words, many people who are not lying are identified as lying. In 1988, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act banned the practice except in special cases. For example, security jobs having to do with nuclear power, water supply, or money, jobs involving direct access to controlled substances, and federal, state, and local government employers, the CIA, and the FBI. It does make one wonder, if the polygraph is a bad idea overall for hiring, why would we make it illegal across the board except for jobs with very high security risks? Now that we know about some of the selection tools that are out there, how do we integrate all this information into an actual hiring decision? There are a couple different approaches. In the hurdle system, which we see here, applicants go through multiple stages. In this example, a resume followed by an ability test, followed by a personality test, followed by an interview. At each stage, those who are seen as unqualified based on their test scores, interview answers, and so on are rejected, leaving a smaller applicant pool still being considered for the job. So you can see that as we go throughout the process of a hurdle system, there are fewer and fewer people still being considered. This is sometimes called a non-compensatory approach because it presumes that a low score on one part of the process can't be compensated for by a high score somewhere else. So if you absolutely need someone to have a certain level of ability to do the job, you'd reject anyone who scores below a certain point on that ability test, no matter how well they might have done on other parts of the hiring process. This approach is often much cheaper than others because you don't have to test and/or interview everyone, only those that passed earlier cutoffs. This is especially true when we use an inexpensive screening method to greatly reduce the size of the applicant pool. For example, several years ago, the NYPD had 65,000 applicants for 6,000 eventual slots in the police academy. So what they did was they created a screening test given on such a massive scale that it was actually held in Madison Square Garden. In a regression approach, all applicants are assessed on each predictor. In other words, everyone is allowed to take part in the entire hiring process from start to finish. The information from all these selection tools is then combined using multiple regression, which is a correlational statistical technique, to create a regression equation. This regression equation is used to rank the applicants based on our best estimate of who is likely to perform well on the job. And the predictors that are better at predicting job performance carry more weight in the equation. An example of this sort of approach is when you apply to college or graduate school. You send in all of your materials, transcripts, letters of recommendation, test scores, and so on. And then that information is combined to make an overall judgment. We sometimes call this strategy a compensatory one because it allows a shortcoming in one area to be compensated for with strengths in other areas. For example, someone with a low score on the cognitive ability test might balance that out with a really high rating on the interview. The underlying assumption here with this strategy is that to do the job well, people can compensate one KSAO for another. Of course, many companies might like to use a combination approach. This might involve beginning with a hurdle system to reduce the size of the applicant pool, such as here with the resume, and then use a regression approach with finalists by sending them through further testing and interviews. So here you can see that many people took the resume, and at that point maybe half or even more were screened out, but then everybody who was left took both tests and the interview. That's it for this video on employee selection.